to think Jesus was talking about people who claim to be saved but are not really saved, and the proof of that is the lack of fruit in their lives, the evidence of any identification in their lives. It really is unclear in the Greek. I want to make that clear this morning. It could be either one. But the point cannot be missed that Jesus said that all of His children are to bear fruit. He said all of them. Every one of them, all of them are to bear fruit. Warren Wiersbe said there is always fruit where there is life. Just as a branch that does not bear fruit is useless, so is a life that does not bear fruit, and both must be dealt with. And I think he's right about that. There is a progression in this text. Did you notice it? Did you pick up on it as we read through? Verse number 2 says that Christians, how many? All Christians bear fruit. And then later in verse 2 it says that they're pruned to bear more fruit, and you know what that is. If you've ever had a garden or cut trees at your house, you know that sometimes you have to cut them back a ways, and it may look at the time like you're damaging them, but next year when they bloom, they're bigger and fuller and brighter and bear more fruit than they ever have because of that pruning process. And so Christians bear fruit, and then they're pruned to bear more fruit. And then verse 8 that we read said they bear much fruit. Fruit, more fruit, and much fruit. The point that cannot be missed is that all Christians bear fruit. Now, the only point that I want to get across to you today is that our only ID as Christians is the fruit that we bear. Now, James says later in the New Testament that anyone can say they have faith. Talk is cheap. Anyone can say they have faith. You probably know of some people who say they have faith, who claim to be Christians, but as you look at their lives, there is not one thing that you can see in their lives that would prove to you, give you any evidence or identification at all that they've ever been truly saved, that they're born again by the Spirit of God. And James says that the proof of saving faith is our works or our fruit. And so again, if God or anyone else were to say to you, so you say you're a Christian, could I see some identification, please? The only thing you would be able to show him is the fruit born in your life. No fruit, no salvation. And so this morning, I want us to think about the fact that God requires fruitfulness. He requires fruitfulness. And some of you, I can already, your wheels are turning. I'm watching you, and I know what you're thinking because I used to think the very same thing. So let me just see if I get this right. Some of you are thinking already, Phil, isn't God just looking for faithfulness? I thought God was into our faithfulness. I thought it was faithfulness that God wanted in my life. You know, all of my life I have heard preachers make that kind of a statement. All God expects from us is faithfulness. And it's usually said in a context of if you believe what's right and you refuse to compromise, then that's what God is looking for in us. I had a pastor friend say to me one day, I asked him, I said, so tell me how your church is doing. And he said, you know, Phil, we haven't grown in a while. We're just hanging on and being faithful. I heard a preacher say in a sermon once, bless God, it doesn't matter if you only have a church of 10 in a city of 1 million as long as you're being faithful. And so my question is, does that fit God's definition of faithfulness? How does God define faithfulness? Now, how many of you believe that God wants us to be faithful? Everybody. Of course He does. There's no question about that. Of course God wants us and even expects us to be faithful. In fact, in Matthew chapter number 25 is one of the greatest stories that Jesus ever told. It's a story of a businessman who had 3 servants, and he was getting ready to go on to on a trip. And in Matthew 25:21, this is what he said to his servants. His Lord said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Good in what? Good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. I think any Christian with any sense at all wants to hear, on the day they meet Jesus Christ face to face, "Well done, good and faithful servant." In fact, I would say that if you're not living your life so that you will hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant," from Jesus when you get to heaven, you need to make some adjustments, and you need to make them right quick. God is into faithfulness. Absolutely He is. But the question that we must grapple with a bit this morning is, how does God define faithfulness? What is faithfulness to God? And we can take it right out of that parable in Matthew 25 that we just read the verse from a moment ago. If you're not familiar with that story, Jesus gave us the story of a man and his 3 servants. And the man, by the way, represents Jesus Himself. And the man left on a trip, and he gave each of his servants some, and the word the Bible uses is talents. Now, we tend to think of talents as being singing or playing an instrument. Wow, the band is really talented. But that's not this word at all. Talent here in the New Testament, Matthew 25, is actually talking about sums of money. And so for the sake of this teaching this morning only, now I'm just telling you the amounts I'm about to give you are not accurate, but just for sake of illustration and for this teaching this morning, let's just say, to make it easy on all of us, that a talent equals $100. Let's just say a talent this morning only is $100. And so Jesus said that when the businessman left, or just before he left, he gave one of his servants 5 talents. And so if a talent is $100, then he had what? $500, okay? For us this morning. The second servant got 2 talents. So for us this morning, $200. And the last guy got 1 talent, or he got $100. Now, Jesus said that the master went on a trip and he came back. And when he came back, the guy that had $500 had doubled it to $1,000. And the guy who had $200 had doubled his to $400. But that guy that just got the $100 bill, that guy went home and he dug into his closet and he got out a cookie jar and he took the lid off and he stuffed that $100 bill in that cookie jar and he sealed the lid tight and he put it up in the closet so that nobody could find it. And if anybody broke in, they would never know it was there. And he made sure nothing ever happened to it. And when his master came back and these other guys had doubled their money, this guy went back to the closet and he got the cookie jar down. He took the $100 bill out and he handed it to his master. And Jesus said his master was livid. He was so angry at that guy. He couldn't believe it. In fact, he said, "Look, the least you could have done was put my money in the bank and then give it back to me today with the interest it earned. You wouldn't even do that." In fact, he called him lazy. He said he was slothful, he was good for nothing, and he threw him out, he fired him. The text uses pretty strong language about the penalty that guy paid. Now, in the context of that verse, Matthew 25:21, "Well done, good and faithful servant," what I'm interested in this morning is why God said those 2 guys were faithful. Why did He say they were faithful? They were faithful because of the fruit they produced. They both had doubled their money. Didn't matter to the master how much money it was. The point was they had done something productive with his money and had doubled it and presented it to him. So, in that context, faithfulness must be defined as producing as much fruit as possible with the resources and the opportunities that God gives us. That's faithfulness. And so is it true to say, well, what God wants in my life is faithfulness? Yes, but we must define faithfulness like God defines it, and God defines faithfulness only in terms of fruitfulness. In other words, if we're not being fruitful, we're not being faithful. Let me say that again. If we're not being fruitful, we're not really being faithful. Did you know that it really is not enough? It is just not enough. It does not please God for Christians, just for instance, to just come and sit, pick a Sunday morning service and come and sit and then that really be their spiritual life for the week. They pretty much do nothing else. They don't give, they don't serve, they just come and attend a service. And if you ask them, they would say, well, yeah, I'm faithful to my church. I never miss a Sunday. But their idea of faithfulness and God's idea of faithfulness would be two different things, because God only defines our faithfulness in terms of our fruitfulness. The question that John 15 raises is this: what is the fruit that God requires to be seen in our lives? If all Christians bear fruit, what